Okay, let's talk about the basics of UV mapping. So we're going to start out with a cube. And let's just take a look at how this cube looks when we look at the UV map. So UV mapping, that is what makes up where the texture information goes, the color information, anything like that, where it can land on the cube. So we have a general modeling editor to look at. If you go to Windows and then modeling editors, UV editor, that's where you can find UV maps. So all of our basic poly models that we bring in automatically have UV maps built in for us, which is nice. But you need to know how to create your own. And when you adjust the geometry, how you want to remove the existing UV map and replace it with something new. But let's take a look at this so far. So I use the right-click menu to go to UV and then UV shell. That lets you select the UV shell of the object. Sometimes objects have multiple UV shells. Often they have multiple UV shells, and you can tell which one is highlighted because when you click on it, both in this UV editor viewport and in your main viewport, it highlights your object's UV shell. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when we apply a checkerboard map to our object. This is just like a nice plus that Maya has built in, where it lets you place a checkerboard on your object, and then you can take a look at how it looks in the viewport, how it looks when it's applied. Okay, the best thing is you can tell your texture is going to look good on your object if the checkerboard doesn't have any skewing. Right now, all of the boxes are the same size. That's awesome. If we were to change our UV map, change our UV shell, and it gets skewed in some direction. Usually on cubes, you won't see this skewing happen. But when we get to our sphere, you'll see what happens when your UV map doesn't look like this. Okay, but to start out, yeah, here's how it looks on a basic cube. And you can always toggle that off as well. Let's take a look at how that same texture looks on a sphere. Okay, so we have our sphere. Let's scale it up and move it away. Okay, and then I still have my UV editor open. If you accidentally closed yours, you go to Windows, Modeling Editor, UV Editor. All right, and I want to take a look at how my checkerboard looks on my sphere. Okay, so as you can see, first of all, this is what the sphere looks like automatically unwrapped. I think this is one way to do it, but of course we have all of these triangles. So other options are to cut the sphere in half and then flatten it that way. I find that to be the most helpful when you're using spheres, especially for things like eyeballs, that sort of thing. And we'll show you how to do that here in a second. But let's take a look again at that checkerboard texture on here. Okay, so a little bit different than how it looked on the cube. The first thing that you might notice is that there's this kind of obvious seam right here. That happens when you're UV mapping. You can see this if you look at the UV shell. The seam that's happening right now, that is the edge of our UV shell. So if I move this over to the side a little bit, you can see that that seam is moving as I'm moving the UV shell. Essentially, what that's showing is where that seam is. Yeah, if I zoom in, and not zoom in, I'm scaling the UV shell down right now. So something else you can notice is you can scale things and move things in the UV editor, and it will not affect the actual object in here. It only affects the UV shell. So it's a lot safer to change things in the UV editor than it is in the regular viewport, because it won't actually affect the geometry of your objects at all, and you can always create a new UV map if you don't like what you did with the previous one. So I'm going to scale down the UV shell in here. General rule of thumb, it's good to have this box right here. Let me turn off the viewport. This light gray box that you can see in here from 1 to 1. This is where everything needs to be if you want it to have texture in your scene. So all of your UV shells need to fit into this space, okay? For this sphere, we only have one UV shell, but if I were to expand it like this, then anything outside of that space won't get regular texture. We have to keep it within this square. General rule of thumb. But it's nice to have it maximize the space, so if you scale it up close to the edges, then you have the most amount of texture space to work with. But as you can see, when we scale down our UV shell, it's increasing the size of those checkers, right, on the actual object, and the seam is more obvious. See this seam right here down the edge where we have the ends of one kind of run into the other. You can especially see it when there's text on the object, right? So when you're choosing where to put seams on your object, think about what would be the least obvious way of doing it. And this will become more apparent as we're adding textures to our object, but that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's look at real quick what this looks like on a cylinder. Okay, so we grab a cylinder real quick, and let's bring it over here, and I'm just going to turn off that checkerboard pattern for a second. Okay, cylinders, they automatically come in with 3 different UV shells. So we have the top cap UV shell, the bottom cap UV shell, and then this is what is going around the edges of our cylinder. Another thing you might notice is my cylinder looks like this, but my UV shell of my cylinder is quite stretched. I can squash this, I can stretch it, I can change it, but it doesn't always match how your object looks in the viewport, especially not when it comes in automatically. So one of the things we like to do is make it so, general rule of thumb, our UV shells tend to stay the same size as each other in scaling. Because if I were to apply the checkerboard here, right, you see how it's kind of squashed in the middle there, and then it looks good on the top and the bottom. If I scale down my edges to more closely match the actual thickness of my edges, as you can see, it looks more square-like, right? But then again, we have the issue of the top and the bottom being very different than the actual cylinder. So let's scale this up to be similar to how the cylinder would actually look if we were to unwrap it. And unwrap basically means you're taking a 3D object and you're unwrapping it into a 2D object. So a cylinder unwraps pretty easily into 2 circles and this and a rectangle, right? But yeah, let's take a look at how it looks now with the checkerboard, and that looks a little bit better, right? So obviously we still have this obvious seam right here, and we also have these seams where the bottom and the top cap meet, but our checkerboard pattern is generally closer to the same size. So if we were to add an image texture that went over those areas, the resolution would be the same in both of these places, and it would make sense. So that's just another thing to be aware of. All right. The other cool thing about UV maps is that in the UV editor, we have an easy way to take this UV shell geometry that we have and turn it into an image so that we can know where in our scene we've decided to put this geometry. Because again, if we move around our UV shells, right, it's going to change how the texture shows up, right? So if I want this, sorry, let's grab this one. Okay, if I want my cap to have no wording or anything like that, then I don't want it to be over the area of the image that has any words, right? But if I want it to have this section of the image, then I can bring it down, and as you can see, I have U1 now on the cap. So again, the checkerboard is just this nice automatically generated pattern that Maya has built in, but we will add our own textures, and you'll see how these change. The other thing to keep in mind is you can overlap geometry. So you see how I kind of overlapped this on top of that. The issue with overlapping is that it's easy to lose which shell goes to which part. It's not as clean, and you can only overlap things that are going to share the exact same texture or color. If you were wanting to have like a silver cap and a red this portion of the cylinder. Anyways, if you wanted this portion of the cylinder to be red and this top portion and bottom portion to be silver, like maybe a Coca-Cola can, you wouldn't want to overlap them at all because your image that you're going to bring in as texture needs to have red in this section and silver where these other sections are. So we'll talk about how to do that as well. There are a couple of quick buttons in here which make things a lot easier. So for you, if you just open this up, maybe your UV toolkit right here isn't showing. So you can always make sure if you need to reopen the UV editor, you can reopen it like that, and it should come in with the UV toolkit right here. Let's go ahead and look at some of these tools in here. So one of the ones I want you guys to pay attention to is, right now you see how I have overlapping UV shells. I don't like that. Also, make sure you have UV shell selected. You can do the right click menu in here as well. I don't like that I have overlapping shells right now, so I want to have it lay out my shells in a way where nothing is overlapping. So I'm going to click layout, and it automatically changes where my UV shells are. And layout's really nice too because it generally makes it organized and maximizes the space as much as possible. So that looks good. So that's a cool button. A couple of other quick things to notice in this UV editor. Obviously, you navigate this the same way that you do the regular viewport. So you can use Alt and your hotkeys to move around, to pan around in here, to zoom in and out. You also use the same hotkeys, W, E, R, and Q, right, to move the UV shells in here as well. And the hotkey is applying to both. So if I scale this object in here, it's not going to affect the UV map. It's actually affecting the geometry. But if I scale the UV shells in here, it is affecting the actual shells and it's not affecting the geometry of the object. So just keep in mind that where you're scaling from, whether you're in the UV editor or the main viewport, will affect what you're actually affecting on your object. All right, that seems like a good place to pause. We'll hop into part 2.